Years ago, Verizon Wireless had an advertising campaign in which you see a guy making calls from various places across the United States, and throughout the entire commercial, the guy kept asking the same 5-word question over and over again. Do you remember what the question was? It was, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" Of course, the point of the commercial was simple. If you use Verizon as your cell phone provider, then you're always going to have a strong connection. Now, if you've ever experienced a bad cell phone connection, you know just how frustrating it can be. A while back, I was talking to a friend of mine, and a few minutes into our phone conversation, the phone went silent. So I quickly redialed that person and started giving them a hard time for hanging up on me. But before they could even respond to what I was saying, the call dropped again. So I dialed again, only this time, before they even said hello, the call dropped for a third time. At which point I just gave up, and we haven't even talked since then. I'm just kidding about that last part, but the first part of the story was true. Now, the reason I was sharing the story with you is because you already know that a cell phone is only as good as its connection. If you can't connect with people, or if you can't connect to the internet, then this is just a really expensive paperweight. And that's true for a whole lot of other things in our life as well. You can have the best sports car ever made, but if the engine is not connected to the drive shaft, that car is not going anywhere. Or you can have the best stereo speakers ever made, but if the Bluetooth signal isn't connected to the tuner, you're not going to hear a sound. And I believe the same is true with people as well. Each one of us is only as strong as our best relationships. Now, through this small group series, we've been looking at 5 famous prayers found in the Bible, and although all of them are good, the one we're going to talk about today might be my favorite. The reason I say that is because this prayer is specifically about you and me. In John chapter 17, we find the longest recorded prayer by Jesus. It's full of purpose, it's full of passion, but what's amazing to me is that right in the middle, Jesus begins praying for us. So let's pick up in verse 20. Let's see what Jesus has to say. Here we go. He says this, "My prayer is not for them alone." Let me stop right there for just a second. Who is the them that Jesus is praying for? Well, that would be his disciples. Jesus has been praying for his followers, and he's been praying for the ministry that he's leaving to them. And so Jesus says, my prayer is for them, but it's not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message. Now, let me stop again. Who is the those that Jesus is praying for at this point? Well, that would be us. That would be you. That would be me. So what is Jesus praying for? What's he praying to God about us for? Well, the text goes on to say that all of them, that would be us, that all of them may be one Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me. May they be brought to complete unity, to let the world know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. Now, when Jesus thought about you and when Jesus thought about me, his greatest concern is that you and I would be one. His greatest concern for the church is that we would be unified, living together in perfect harmony. So why was this such a big deal to Jesus? Well, Jesus knew that people outside the church could not see God, but they could see God's people. And Jesus knew that what people see in us is what they're going to believe about God. If they see hatred and division in us, then they're going to believe that God is hateful and that God is divisive. But if they see unity and love in us, then they're going to believe that that's who God is as well. And just so you know, the theme of oneness didn't stop with the prayer of Jesus. It actually runs throughout the entire New Testament. In fact, there are over 40 one another commands that remind us exactly what it means to be one church. And so what I want to do with the rest of our group time is I want to share with you 3 of my favorite one another commands. This is in your notes. You can write this down. But these are 3 ways that we can live together as one church. First, to be one, we must accept one another. We must accept one another. Now, one word we often use to describe the church would be the word family. And the cool thing about family is our families see the real deal in us. I mean, they know everything about us, right? The good and the bad, the good, the bad, and the ugly for that matter. I mean, they see us when we get up in the morning. They smell our breath when it's rank. They hear us when we sing out of tune in the shower. They know all of our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, and yet in spite of all of our idiosyncrasies, in spite of all of our faults, we're still family and we are still accepted in our family unit, just the way that we are. Well, that's the kind of relationship God wants in the church, but it's not always easy to do, is it? I can remember being sick one time. I was at the church office and I'd been feeling bad all morning, so I went in a little bit late. But because I was sick and people knew I was sick, guess what? Nobody wanted to be around me, right? They didn't want to get close to me, which I totally understood. But the kicker came when they wouldn't even let me get close to the coffee maker. They said, no, you can't have any coffee because you're not feeling well. Now, I understand why nobody wanted to get near me on that day because I was sick, right? But it got me to thinking, how often do we do the same thing to one another or with the people that God puts in our lives? Maybe we do it on purpose, maybe we don't do it on purpose. But think about this, how often do I keep my distance from people because they aren't like me? Or maybe because they come off needy, or maybe because their personality rubs me the wrong way. Probably happens more often than we would like to admit. But let me ask you something. How would Jesus treat that person or those people? Jesus was always making time for people who were on the outside looking in. Jesus was always quick to accept those who other people had written off, and he did the same thing for us too, which is why Romans chapter 15 verse 7 says this. It says, accept one another then, just as Christ accepted you in order to bring praise to God. Did you know it brings praise to God when we accept one another? Well, it certainly does, which brings us to number 2. Here we go. A second way we become one is we spur one another. We spur one another. What in the world does that mean? Well, let me illustrate it this way. Growing up, my brother and I, we owned boxing gloves, and on a regular basis, we would pull out the gloves and we would spar with one another in the living room. I remember that every fight would start and end basically the same way. We would start by smiling and laughing and joking around, right? We would take a few jabs, we would dodge a few punches, but inevitably someone would land a solid punch, and then it was game on. All the laughing would stop, and suddenly we were trying to hurt one another with those boxing gloves. Of course, one of us would end up getting mad and start chasing the other one all around the living room, and mom and dad would come in, they would break things up, and they would make us kiss or hug and make up. That's how it was. But what I learned is that sparring always leads to fighting, and fighting always leads to hurt feelings and damaged relationships. So let me just be clear. As a church, we are not supposed to spar with one another. Instead, we're supposed to spur one another. So what does that mean? We'll check out Hebrews chapter 10, starting with verse 24. It says this, and let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Now, another way that we could say that word spur or a synonym for spur would be to provoke or to move, right? And that sounds like pretty strong language for church people. I mean, my brother and I would provoke each other to fight by throwing punches. So what does it really mean to provoke one another or to move one another? Well, it means that we don't give up on one another. In the first century, it's obvious that some people were starting to drop out of regular church attendance. They were starting to drift away from Christ. And so the author of Hebrews, what does he do? He reminds us of how important it is that we don't allow one another to become complacent or become comfortable in our faith. Instead, we are to look for ways to challenge and inspire and move one another to love and good deeds. So if someone has missed a few group meetings, it might be a good idea for you to reach out to them and challenge them to a good old-fashioned boxing match. Okay, I'm kidding about that part. We don't challenge them to a fight. We don't want to spar with them. We want to spur them on. And so we want to reach out to them, and in love, we want to let them know that we miss them, and we want to encourage them to come back to group and be an active participant with their church family. Which leads me to one final one another. Here it is. To be one, we must forgive one another. We must forgive one another. My wife Irene and I Praise God, we've been married for over 10 years, hard to believe. And I love telling people the secret to the success of our marriage. The secret to success in our marriage, it's very simple. Here's the secret. You want to know what it is? Here it is. I'm really good at saying, I'm sorry. And Irene is really good at saying, all is forgiven. That's the secret sauce right there. Now, if you're married, you get this, but even people who are in love don't always get along, right? But the only way they're going to stay together is if they find ways in their heart to forgive. But by the way, this might shock some of you, but even in churches, people can and will get their feelings hurt. I know that's hard to believe, but I can promise you, if you attend church or hang out in a small group long enough, someone is probably going to say or do something that is going to cause you to get angry or upset. And when it happens, you're going to have to decide how you're going to respond. Colossians chapter 3, verse 13 encourages us to do this. It says, bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Now, anytime somebody hurts us, we have two choices. We can bear a grudge, or we can bear with one another. Of course, when we bear a grudge, we might be tempted to get even, or we might even be tempted to cut that person out of our lives. Either way, the relationship never has a chance to be restored or to be reconciled. But if we bear with one another, we basically give up our right to get even, and we don't cut the other person out of our lives. Instead, we cut the other person some slack, which opens the door to reconciliation. Now, I know that forgiveness is never easy, which is why we are to forgive as the Lord has forgiven us. Grace is always easier to give when I remember how much grace has been given to me. Maybe there's someone in your life right now who's hurt you, and you need to forgive them. They need to be forgiven by you. Or maybe there's someone in your life that you've hurt, and you need to ask them for forgiveness. Regardless of the situation, it's always best to go to that person and just own it. Rather than waiting and hoping that it all gets smoothed out and it's all going to be fine, the best plan is to simply meet and talk. Own your part and be the first to apologize. Let them know you've been hurt, or let them know that you know you've hurt them. But either way, get the ball rolling toward reconciliation and bear with one another. Well, at this time, study questions have been provided for your leaders, and I can't wait to hear how well your discussion goes once you're finished today.